Hi, Brian Lehrer here. Up next, Brian Lehrer Weekend. 3 of our favorite segments from the week packaged together for you to listen to on the weekend. So enjoy, and I'll see you back on the radio Monday at 10 a.m. on WNYC and WNYC.org.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, filling in for Brian today. Happy Friday. Coming up on today's show, we'll talk about the deal President Trump and Senate Democrats have said they reached to continue funding the government, and what's happening with the changes to the Department of Homeland Security and its immigration enforcement operations that Democrats were demanding. Siobhan Hughes from the Wall Street Journal will be with us in about half an hour to talk about that. Plus, have you heard about the general strike some activists are planning for today? Are you participating? We'll talk to Rutgers labor relations professor Eric Blanc about the history of general strikes, they're relatively rare, and how this one today might go. And we'll wrap today's show with your calls about your cozy hobbies. We're talking about activities like knitting and other textile arts, maybe puzzles, playing board games, or, are you back to baking sourdough? You get the idea. What have you gotten into during this incredibly frigid stretch of winter? And is it helping you feel more grounded during what is a tough time for so many people? We want to hear about your cozy hobbies around 11:40 today. But first, it's January 30th. There's just one day left in what has felt like a very long month. For New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, it started like this.
Please repeat after me. I, Zohran Kwame Mamdani.
I, Zohran Kwame Mamdani.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
And it's ending like this. Here's about a minute from one of the latest videos released from the mayor's office about the state of snow removal.
Across all 5 boroughs, we've melted 23 million pounds of snow using 8 snow melting sites like this one. We've cleared 12,850 crosswalks and 10,450 bus stops, including 98% of sheltered stops, and that work continues around the clock. Every 12-hour shift, 2,500 sanitation workers are out there clearing bus stops, crosswalks, hydrants, and other critical infrastructure. Another 100 DSNY workers, 300 contractors, and 800 emergency snow shovelers are breaking up snow ridges and hauling snow out of our neighborhoods. We've spread 116 million pounds of salt across the city so far. At the same time, outreach teams are working 24/7 to bring homeless New Yorkers inside. In just 10 days, we've made more than 600 placements into safe havens and shelters, opened 20 warming buses, and 18 enhanced warming centers. Let me be clear, no one who needs help will be turned away.
Okay, your head might be spinning. There were a lot of numbers in there. But so far, Mayor Mamdani has received generally high marks for the city's response to the first major snowstorm on his watch, including one of the longest stretches of sub-freezing weather that we've had to deal with in a very long time. One stat he did not mention, the 10 New Yorkers so far who've lost their lives since the start of this extreme cold stretch. But that's far from everything we've seen in this first very busy month for the Mamdani administration. Joining me now to break down what we've seen so far and where we're headed, plus to take your calls, is my colleague from the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, politics reporter Elizabeth Kim. Liz, good morning. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Bridget.
So, Liz, we're going to go through some of the highs and lows of this first month, but I started by playing a little sound from Mayor Mamdani's inauguration. That was, of course, the Dayside event. And for those of you who might have missed it, that was Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders giving Mamdani the oath of office. I covered that event. But Liz, you covered something that was very cool the night before that. Can you describe it?
And I think I lucked out with the better assignment, Bridget, because I know it was very, very cold.
It was.
On Inauguration Day. And it actually wasn't that cold the night before for the swearing-in ceremony. So Mamdani elected to have his swearing-in ceremony inside this hidden subway station that runs beneath City Hall. This subway station is what I would describe it as is it's this kind of bygone era. It represents this bygone era of sort of civic glamour, this kind of Beaux-Arts architecture. I think that New Yorkers are probably more familiar with this type of architecture with Grand Central Station. So this is sort of like a little taste of that. It's a smaller scale of that. You know, you walk inside and, you know, we were escorted by city officials, you know, down this hidden staircase, and it's kind of amazing. You know, it opens up this secret passageway where you see these vaulted tile ceilings. They're brass chandeliers, they're skylights. It opened in 1904, but it closed in 1945 because the platforms were too short. But the setting was obviously symbolic, right? You know, the mayor himself said, you know, transit is the lifeblood of the city. But it was also meant to set the tone for this aspiration towards excellence.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, one of the things that distinguished Mamdani's campaign was very clear messaging. You know, from your perspective, you know, it sounds like part of the message he was trying to convey, you know, symbolically, if nothing else, in that particular ceremony was something maybe a bit more aspirational about city government?
Right. You know, I was thinking about this on my way to work today. And, you know, what he's doing in this moment is, like I said, you know, he's trying to say that this is some kind of bygone era where government could build these really amazing landmarks. And, you know, the subway station is a place, it's a sort of democratizing space because everyone can use the subway. And like I said, this is the economic engine for the city. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that no longer exists, because I think if we can think about, there are recent new transit hubs that the city has actually built, and I think they do kind of conjure this sense of grandeur that the city is able to, that government can actually do quite amazing things. I mean, just think about the Oculus, for example, and the experience of walking through that. But I think, yes, like things like, he's kind of saying, like, why can't we do more types of ambitious projects like this? Because government, can be excellent. And he's kind of, right off the bat, he's sending that message, and he's setting a bar for himself and his administration.
Listeners, we want you to be part of this conversation. If you could give the mayor a letter grade for his performance this past month, what would it be and why? What do you think about some of the early policy moves to protect tenants, expand childcare? What about some of his political decisions, his push to get Albany to tax the rich? What do you make of his communication style? Do you like those types of social media videos? Did you feel like the city was on top of the storm? Call in and give us your letter grade for Mamdani's first month in office and why. The number is 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can call or text that number. So, Liz, you're talking about how he had, set the bar for himself. And one of the things that he did right after that Dayside inauguration ceremony was to show that this was going to be an administration that was going to work. So, he went from that big ceremony outside City Hall where there were, some folks partying and there are freezing cold block parties outside, to an apartment in Brooklyn where he signed an executive order. One was to revitalize the Office to Protect Tenants. And he appointed a woman named Sia Weaver as its director. Talk about that decision to reset up this office and why that sparked some controversy.
Well, first of all, if you run on the issue of affordability, the biggest cost that makes, the city unaffordable is housing. Mm-hmm. So in many ways, it was very smart for him to tackle sort of the biggest ticket item that New Yorkers face and what really prices New Yorkers out of this city is how much they pay in rent. So right off the bat, he appoints a new director for this office to protect tenants. And I think, it was not surprising. He's known Sia Weaver for a long time. She's a very prominent tenant advocate in Albany. She does have experience. What happened afterwards, though, was the surfacing of some of her tweets. And she has a lot of tweets. She has a long history of tweets. And I think that some of what she said is not particularly surprising. She has been this really outspoken defender of tenant rights and a critic of the role that racism plays in housing policy. And that's been well documented, Bridget, through the history of redlining. But nevertheless, statements she made like, quote unquote, home ownership is a weapon of white supremacy, it raised eyebrows and it was polarizing. And this is, I think, something that immediately, I think his transition team realized they would have to confront because, this is a young mayor. He's 34 years old. He's, the youngest mayor in over a century. He's surrounded by other people that are around his age. And these are people that came of age, they're very online, in other words.
Sure.
And they came of age in the internet. And you can expect that they're going to have lengthy social media histories. So I think right off the bat, I think it was very instructive to see, how does the administration sort of handle that? And that this is something that's going to be scrutinized by people, by his political opponents and critics.
Another decision, Liz, that was seized upon by some of Mamdani's skeptics was his decision to sign an executive order rescinding all of the previous executive orders signed by former Mayor Adams after September 26th, 2024. And he didn't just pluck that date out by accident, right?
No. He chose that date because that was the date of Eric Adams's indictment on federal corruption charges. And his argument was that this was the day that New Yorkers lost trust in Adams because every policy decision that he made after that date could be construed as him trying to cozy up to the Trump administration for a pardon. Adams has, of course, vehemently denied that was ever the case. But, the mayor's poll numbers did plummet after that indictment. And I think many New Yorkers did feel that the mayor was compromised. At the same time, like you said, Bridget, there were skeptics. Mm-hmm. And the skeptics kind of questioned whether this was just kind of convenient framing for the mayor because the mayor wanted to undo specifically policies around Israel and anti-Semitism that he knew would draw a lot of attention. And, the mayor, he is the first mayor in recent memory that has been a sharp critic of Israel and the government's treatment of Palestinians. It was no surprise that he would want to undo some of these orders. One of the orders that he undid was Mayor Adams had codified a certain definition of anti-Semitism. Another executive order that he undid was one that banned city agencies from boycotting Israel. There was a third that actually was interesting. There were several that he did not undo. Mayor Adams created an office to combat anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. There was a little bit confusion in the beginning when he kind of issued this order of revoking them, and then the mayor had to actually step back and clarify, no, that is not one I am undoing. There was another one that he ultimately ended up just kind of amending, but there was an order that allowed the police department to review how it polices protests outside houses of worship.
For those of you just joining us, this is the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, filling in for Brian today. My guest is Elizabeth Kim, politics reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, my colleague. We're taking stock of the first month of the Mamdani administration, and we're taking your calls. What grade would you give the mayor in his first month in office, and why? Let's go to Ariella in Lower Manhattan. Ariella, you're on WNYC.
Hi, this is incredible. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I would give Mayor Mamdani a B+. I am Jewish. I am a proud supporter of Israel and of Israeli descent. I did not vote for Mamdani, and I am heartened by the way in which he has very vocally and vehemently condemned the anti-Semitic attacks that have happened since he took office. I am very cautiously optimistic that he is going to do right by the Jewish people. So that has been a relief. And as far as somebody who lives in the city and commutes all over the city for work, the roads and the streets are not so bad. So I definitely will give him a B+. Very cautiously optimistic with what he's done so far.
Ariella, thanks so much for that call. We appreciate it. Listeners, we want to hear your grade and why for the first month of the Mamdani administration. The number 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. Liz, before we move on from this, on those executive orders, particularly the ones related to Israel and anti-Semitism, one of the loudest critics of Mamdani when he signed that initial executive order rescinding them was City Council Speaker Julie Menin. She is essentially the second most powerful elected official in city government. She was not the favored candidate of Mamdani for the speakership. But she was elected by unanimous consent in the 51-member city council. So how would you say that she has been positioning herself against the mayor?
You know, from the very beginning, she has been described as someone who would be a check on the mayor. And I've kind of really been watching her closely to see whether or not that's fair. I think what we can tell from these early weeks is she's certainly asserting herself in a way that might be a departure from other speakers. The term I've heard lately from some critics is shadow mayor. And I think some of that is from the fact, like, just to name a recent example, she was very much on the ground during the snowstorm. She tweeted out a photo of herself. She was in a sanitation jacket. This is sort of the role that you would expect a mayor to play. Sure. You know, she's been out in front with her own social media and her own videos. You know, what I would say, though, to people who criticize this, it is her prerogative to decide what kind of speaker she wants to be.
Absolutely.
You know, but she has, she has set up some countervailing policies that do appear to be a check on the mayor. She set up her own, task force to combat anti-Semitism. She has introduced legislation in which she wants to set up a certain amount of distance, a bill that would propose how far protesters outside houses of worship can stand. That's likely to face a lot of constitutional challenges. It's unclear that the city can do that legally. All the same, she is making a statement with these kinds of decisions, and also, with the optics of, like I said, being out there in a sanitation jacket.
We're going to take a short break. More with my guest, WNYC and Gothamist politics reporter Elizabeth Kim, and of course your calls coming up. Stick around. It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, filling in for Brian today. We're talking about Mayor Mamdani's first month with my WNYC and Gothamist newsroom colleague, Elizabeth Kim. Liz, we were talking about the relationship between Mayor Mamdani and Speaker Menin, and I think you had something to add there.
Yes. I think I think to be fair, you have to also point to the areas in which she and the mayor have, come together and united on policies. She was very much for the mayor's, universal child care plan. She's even, very interested in his idea for free buses. And right off, the bat, in the beginning weeks, she appeared at a press conference with the mayor to ban so-called junk fees. These are these very hard to decipher fees that you might see when you're booking a concert or booking a hotel room. She's very much about consumer protection and also worker rights. So there is, they do have a list of shared priorities. However, when it comes to these other issues like Israel, I think that gets a little bit outsized attention, mostly I think because people do like to sort of focus on the areas of tension, but also because of the mayor's relationship with the Jewish community is so fraught and sensitive.
I want to shift gears a little bit to some of the policy conversation, but a reminder to listeners, we are taking your calls and your letter grades for the first month of Mayor Mamdani's term in office. And I want to sneak in a caller. Let's go to Michael in Queens. Michael, thanks for holding on. What do you grade Mamdani's first month in office?
How you doing? I'd say an A. One of the things that I noticed, he had a press conference after the storm, and he mentioned particularly to thank, the New Yorkers that helped each other and helping, the young people helping the elderly and people shoveling each other out, and to congeal the constituents and to have hopefulness in the community. And as a New Yorker where we've always helped each other out, it was nice to see the nod to that. And it kind of puts the social and democratic socialism where, we have to help each other. And I appreciated that from him.
Michael, thanks so much for that call. Liz, let's talk a little bit more about some of the policy achievements or first steps, we should probably say, in this first month of office. One of the mayor's signature campaign pledges was to achieve universal child care for all New Yorkers. And that hasn't happened yet, but he got a pretty big boost in his first week in office thanks to Governor Kathy Hochul.
And today I'm proud to announce that New York State is paying the full cost to launch 2Care for the first time. Universal daycare for 2-year-olds as proposed by Mayor Mamdani. And we're not just paying for 1 year of the program. We don't usually go 1 year out in our budget. But just to let you know how serious we are, we're taking the unprecedented step to not just commit for the 2027 budget, which I'm working on right now, but also the following year as well to show you we're in this for the long haul.
So, Liz, let's talk both the substance and optics of this announcement. You've got Mayor Mamdani at a YMCA in Flatbush, Brooklyn, standing there with Governor Hochul. Of course, the photo op is the two of them hand in hand, raising their fists together, celebrating this new money for expanding childcare. And they're surrounded by childcare advocates and, of course, kids. You can hear them in that clip we just heard. This is a big deal, but it's not a done deal.
That's right. It's I thought it was interesting to hear the governor say, to prove that we're in it for the long haul, we're also paying for the second year. That doesn't sound like the long haul for me, to me, right? To my ears, right? That's 2 years.
Right.
Like, what about the rest of the life of the program? How is it going to be financed? But no doubt, it's a huge win. I keep thinking about, what would have happened if former Mayor Bill de Blasio had been able to have Cuomo at his side, right off the bat when he rolled out his very ambitious plan for universal pre-K, and the two of them had come together on that. Wouldn't that have been something? But this is kind of why I think to political observers, it's wow, right off the bat, he has the backing from the governor. But we should say, he has leverage. Has leverage over the governor. The governor is running for re-election. He was elected on this, broadly popular idea of having the government be more proactive in helping New Yorkers, in helping fund childcare for children younger than age 3. In New York City, that, along with housing, is one of the driving costs that make the city unaffordable. So, yes, it is. But no doubt, it is a big win. But in a way, I do wonder, it immediately puts the ball in his court, right? Because she's paying for the first 2 years. The question then becomes, well, how do we sustain it? And then there's even the bigger question of how does he implement it?
Well, let's get to that. And that's part of what I think is interesting, both how to pay for it, how to sustain it. I mean, launching what is essentially another grade is a huge lift. We saw that under the de Blasio administration. It took, every facet of government working together to get pre-K off the ground, and then to ensure there was long-term funding for it. Hochul is saying she's going to pay the first 2 years. But at the same time, Mamdani has been keeping up this pressure about raising taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers and corporations. He was up in Albany, and just after her State of the State speech, where he actually was in the audience, led the standing ovation when she talked about funding childcare, he said this when he was talking to reporters after her speech.
There is no question that New York City requires additional recurring revenue. And we inherited a budget that mismanaged finances at every turn. And our city also plays an outsized role in supporting the state. That in itself is a legacy of the prior governor. And we also have to ensure that we have the resources not only to fund our affordability agenda, but also to fund the demands of our city's budget. And this is a moment in time where we saw a historic number of New Yorkers, more than 1 million, come out to support an agenda that would not only protect what New Yorkers had, but also advance a vision of a city where they could afford to live in. And that's also an agenda where we made explicit to pay for by raising taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers and the most profitable corporations. And I look forward to making the case directly to our partners in Albany as to what our city needs to not only be able to operate sustainably, but also to fulfill an agenda that will keep New Yorkers in New York.
So, Liz, that was 2 weeks ago. So I'm wondering how you hear that clip now. I remember thinking when I heard it at the time, oh, this is foreshadowing. Like, this is how we're going to hear him talk about the budget going into the city's budget cycle. Given what we heard from the mayor's office this week, that kind of unexpected preview we got to how he is framing his preliminary budget. How does that hit your ears now?
Well, you're right, Bridget. He was basically sort of foreshadowing, tipping his hand as to how he was going to make his argument to the state when he proposes his preliminary budget. And what he's arguing is, essentially two things. He's arguing that Eric Adams mismanaged the city budget and that we are in a grave financial crisis. So we're going to need help from the state. He's also putting some of the blame on the city's finances on not the current governor, but the governor who was in Albany 5 years prior, Andrew Cuomo, by saying that making the argument that there has been this long-standing imbalance between what the revenues that the city sends to Albany and what Albany gives back. Now, that has been an argument for a very, very long time. And then he's going back to one of his core principles, which is we need to raise taxes on the rich. Now, I think we were talking earlier about sort of what kind of tone he was trying to set with both the swearing in and also his inauguration day speech. And I think the line that a lot of us remember that stood out on that day, and there were a lot of good lines that he had in that speech, but it was the one where he said, I was elected as a Democratic Socialist, and I will govern as a Democratic Socialist. And then you saw the camera sort of pan to Bernie Sanders and AOC applauding approvingly. And, I think at the time, a lot of us were wondering, what does that really mean? And I think that what we've seen that mean is his identity as a Democratic Socialist is rooted in this belief that there needs to be more wealth redistribution and wealth redistribution through taxation. So far we've seen him hew to that belief and that rhetoric. And we've seen it, through that stage of the game, which was, when Hochul delivered her State of the State and his response to it to this week when he kind of laid out, his sort of, I think, opening salvo around his preliminary budget, which is due next month.
Exactly. And I think it's a line that we heard more from him about this week, and we're going to continue to hear justifying why he thinks this tax increase is really necessary for him to be able to keep up the services the city is currently offering and then potentially keep any of the campaign promises that he made.
Well, in part, he could say, Hochul's giving me $4.5 billion for 2 years. Where's the rest of the money going to come from?
Right.
And that's essentially part of his argument, in addition to saying that the city's finances are in dire straits.
So I want to get in more of our callers and your texts. One listener wrote that they give Mamdani a B so far, even though 1 month in, with a little emoji, kudos for pushing back on this hyper-focus of Israel. Foreign policy is not part of the mayor's job, not doing great on this storm cleanup. And Mamdani coming down so hard on Adams' quote deficit is just so old school. Mm-hmm. You ran to be mayor, you own the budget. But let's get some listeners, some callers in who may offer their own grades. Lauren in Brooklyn, how would you grade the first month of the Mamdani administration?
Hi, great to be on. I would say I'm going to go B+ because I'm optimistic, but there are things that I want to see. Like, it was crazy to immediately secure childcare funding day one. But like you said, it's only for 2 years. And if we don't get that baseline in the budget, that is going to be a huge burden for the city to have to make back long term. And we're already seeing problems right now where programs have been expanded, but the funding has only been secured for it for a couple of years. And so you're left with these huge deficits. And if that continues, it's going to be a huge problem for the city. And because of term limits, mayors aren't really incentivized, especially one-term mayors aren't really incentivized to baseline that funding.
Lauren, important issues that you're raising. Thank you for that. Let's go to Edie in Brooklyn. Edie, you're on WNYC.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I would give Mayor Mamdani, an A. His handling of the storm was amazing. His outreach to people during this time was wonderful. I also have great hope for all the citizens in our city with him as a mayor. I hope that he continues on that path, and I appreciate what he's doing. Take care. Thank you.
Edie, thanks for your call. Appreciate it. So, Liz, some decent marks from our listeners so far. I'm seeing some people who have some critiques are not giving me their grades. They're just writing some frustration with some over the snow handling, some objecting, just to his political roots. Some people who don't like the fact that he is so affiliated with the Democratic Socialists of America, and critiquing him on that front. I do want to talk a little bit more about the snow response, which you had written about as potentially an early test for the administration. I remember covering...
It's a classic test,
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the beginning of the de Blasio administration, he was socked with a snowstorm, and then he was, buried in complaints from Upper East Siders who said that the plowing just was not sufficient in that part of the city. How do you think Mamdani is handling things so far?
Well, there are two parts to that test, right? One part is messaging, which it seems like some of the people who have called in and have given him good grades felt he was very successful at. And that's no surprise. He is a very skilled communicator. And then there is good old, execution. And what that boils down to is, was your street plowed? I was laughing because every time, I was listening to the radio and I would listen to Mamdani or another city official would say, New York City has the biggest snow fighting operation in the country. And it just made it sound like, wow, we're really able to do this. Now, the city has maintained that every street got shoveled at least once. But at the same time, and, this is not new. This is not just happening under Mamdani. This happens every time there is a very big snowstorm, which is this question of what about the sidewalks? What about the crosswalks? What about the bus stops? And I don't think the city has really come up with a good answer to that. And, particularly with this snowstorm, because the temperatures have remained, have hovered around freezing, this snow, it's still out there. And there are images that we've seen, or I'm sure everyday New Yorkers have seen, trying to get to a bus stop, where there are mounds and mounds of snow, I'm watching parents, people in wheelchairs, trying to just cross the street is extremely difficult. So I think that is one question that has been put to the mayor. Should the city be doing more? Of course, we do understand that property owners are responsible for their own sidewalks, but let's be honest, there are many property owners who do not get to it very quickly. But you as a pedestrian, you need to get to where you need to go, and you're going to need to traverse that sidewalk. So I think this raises good questions for the mayor. And then, we'll see. I presume there'll be more snowstorms to come under his tenure.
Absolutely. I mean, to your point, Liz, I think we are witnessing him learn the complexity of really running the city in real time. And again, the marks that many observers have given have been relatively positive. But hearing those updates from the Office of Emergency Management, the sort of tentative initial position he took on whether, city school kids would get a snow day, and then having to sort of reposition that. Here's a little bit of what he said at one of those updates over the weekend.
We have stress-tested systems, sent students home with the materials and technology they need to learn virtually, and are working with vendors to ensure that our systems have the capacity that they need. And I know that this may disappoint some students, so if you do see me, feel free to throw a snowball at me.
So, of course, that's the mayor, and this was actually on Monday, just reinforcing the fact that instead of the traditional snow day where maybe you'd be outside, I think he told a story at one point of hurting his arm by sledding in a garbage can when he was a kid, that would not be formally part of the day, that kids were supposed to do some version of remote school. There were some hiccups, but it wasn't quite on the scale of what we saw in the previous year, the previous snowstorm, which I think was 2 years ago.
I mean, that's like that clip you played, that's a testament to his ability to communicate effectively, right? Like, he knows he's going to be criticized by some parents over the shift to remote day. He knows he knows the kids are unhappy, but he says, "Hey, throw a snowball at me." And time again, he's able to use humor to sort of deflect that kind of criticism. But we should note, Bridget, as you've talked about it yourself, is that it's the unexpected things that happened. And in this case, it was the deaths of 10 New Yorkers who died outside. Yeah. Now, the Coalition for the Homeless has said, Dave Geffen had said that, he can't remember in recent history when that many New Yorkers have died in this short time period of very frigid temperatures. And I think to a lot of people, it's alarming. And the question is, and it's a fair question, did the mayor anticipate this? And was the city prepared? Did it proactively do enough to bring homeless New Yorkers inside?
Well, that's a question that I think we're going to keep focusing on as we get through this very cold stretch of weather. As you all know, listeners, it is not done yet. The forecast for next week is just as cold. And dangerous, yeah. And dangerous, yeah. And, to be clear, in this initial conversation about the Mamdani administration, Liz and I, who report on city politics, are very aware that this is just the beginning. And so we're doing more of a pulse check, and we appreciate listeners who participated in giving this first month a grade I think ultimately we know that the grade is incomplete because this is the very early stage of the administration, but a way for us to sort of check in with how people are feeling, how they're doing, and have you part of our conversation. Liz, we've got a lot of work to do, but I'll see you back in the newsroom. Thanks for joining me this morning.
Thanks, Bridget.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm producer Amina Serna, filling in for Brian today. Good morning again, everyone. When we think of artificial intelligence, what comes to mind? Chatbots or uncanny images of humans with extra fingers? Maybe data centers and your utility bills? Or dread about the future of the labor market? What about healthcare? AI is already diagnosing diseases, analyzing CT scans, and assisting in patient care, sometimes more efficiently than doctors. This raises an uncomfortable question. If AI can do a lot of the diagnostic work, what are the physicians supposed to do? How do we teach the next generation of doctors to use these tools but not develop biases or an over-reliance on them? Medical schools are already grappling with these questions. This fall, Stanford Medicine became one of the first U.S. medical schools to make AI training mandatory for all medical and PA students. With me now to talk about how we train doctors when the tech is changing faster than the curriculum and what this all means for patients is Dr. Lloyd Minor, Dean of Stanford University School of Medicine and VP of Medical Affairs at Stanford University. Dr. Minor, welcome to WNYC.
Thank you, Amina. It's great to be with you today.
So doctors are already using artificial intelligence, right? Can you give us some examples of things AI is doing in medicine right now?
Sure. And you in your introduction covered a lot of really exciting things that are going on in applications of AI in medicine today. But from assisting in the reading of diagnostic studies such as radiographs to assisting in interpretation of pathology slides, to how we manage our electronic medical records, to how a doctor or healthcare system requests authorization from an insurance company. All these are areas today that are being impacted by AI. And, it's clear, it's not clear exactly how the practice of medicine is going to be different 3, 5, 10 years from now, but I think it is clear that it is going to be different. And what we've tried to do at Stanford is to first educate our students and those of us who are already in practice about the use of large language models, the use of other forms of AI, in order to prepare us so that not only will we follow this revolution, but that we'll be able to lead it and responsibly deploy the AI.
Listeners, do we have any doctors or lab technicians already using AI in the workplace? How has it impacted your workflow or maybe patient outcomes? Call or text us at 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. And for anyone else, maybe some patients, I don't know if you've come across your doctor using AI and in what ways. You can help us report this story. And we can take your questions and comments on the use of AI in medicine for our guest, Dr. Lloyd Minor, Dean of Stanford University School of Medicine. Dr. Minor, what is AI actually doing in cancer research and treatment right now? Maybe stuff that wasn't possible even a few years ago.
Sure. I think cancer is one of the most exciting areas where the deployment of AI is already beginning to have impact and will have even greater impact in the future. Let me mention one example that we're pioneering here at Stanford. A patient with a complicated cancer like colon cancer or ovarian cancer or pancreatic cancer, their care will be coordinated by surgeons, medical oncologists, radiation oncologists. There'll oftentimes be nutritionists involved. And typically, all of those providers, those experts, will meet in what's called a tumor board, and they'll discuss the patient's findings and they'll discuss the treatment plan. Now, we're starting to enable those tumor boards with an analysis through AI of the patient, their imaging studies, their other medical conditions, so that the AI is certainly not making a decision about what treatment they'll receive, but the participants, the doctors who are a part of that tumor board, are getting information from AI that they may not have seen themselves before, or relationships between the therapy that a patient might receive and what we know about other patients who've received similar therapies, relationships that they might not be aware of. So I think already today, it's in its early stages, but already today, we're seeing the power of AI in impacting, making sure that the right patient gets the right treatment at the right time.
And what about clinical trials? How is AI changing that process?
One way that AI is changing clinical trials is making all of us aware of when our patients are eligible for a clinical trial. So now in our electronic patient record, if you know the listing of all of our clinical trials is running in the background, and the person taking care of the patient will receive a notification from the electronic health record saying, your patient may be eligible for this trial. Click here and you'll learn more about the trial. There are literally hundreds of trials that are open at any one time, and no expert, no faculty member, no resident, fellow, student can keep all of those in their head at one time. So this makes sure that providers have information about a trial a patient may be eligible for that they might not have considered before.
You write that better management of early stage diabetes could reduce all-cause mortality in patients by nearly 20%. So what about chronic diseases like diabetes or heart disease? How's AI being used there?
I think AI is being used in several ways in the management of chronic diseases. And as you said, these chronic diseases are a major cause of both morbidity and mortality in the United States, as well as a major driver of cost in the healthcare system. One of the most serious problems in the treatment and the management of chronic diseases is the coordination of the various different components in the care. So a patient with diabetes, for example, diet plays a major role. There may also be a role for medications, or particularly the newer medications like the GLP-1 agonists. How do you bring together all that together to coordinate a treatment plan for the patient? How do you make sure that patients who need home healthcare assistance are actually getting that assistance? What AI can and is doing is coordinating the various different components in a patient's care delivery plan, so that less of that has to be orchestrated by social workers, by home health nurses. More of the coordination is being achieved through the deployment of AI. And I also think one of the most exciting things about AI and its use in medicine today is it's taking a lot of the administrative burden off of healthcare providers, doing a lot of the things that would have required human effort before. Now those are being done through technology, through AI, and we as providers can focus on what we've always wanted to do and what we should do, and that is interacting with patients and providing the very best care one-on-one with patients and their families, rather than having to spend so much time in the administrative activities where we're not really interacting with patients.
Are these new practices being used by everyday doctors yet? And can you explain what you mean by the no-do gap? And are we seeing the same lag with AI?
I think that the deployment of AI, it's varying. First of all, as you mentioned in the introduction, this is evolving so rapidly. Large language models just became available to the public in November of 2022. I mean, it's an incredibly short period of time for a fundamentally new technology. So I think probably academic centers, major centers are deploying AI first. But one of the things we've been doing over these past several years is working with Alice Walton and colleagues in Northwest Arkansas. I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I've had the privilege of working with Alice and her colleagues over the past 3 years and starting a new medical school in Northwest Arkansas, the Alice Walton School of Medicine. We have 48 students enrolled in the first class, an amazing leadership team there led by Dean Sharmila Makija. And we're sharing all of the developments we're having in AI and medical education here at Stanford. We're sharing those with our colleagues in Northwest Arkansas. So there's a big role for us in academic medicine to make sure we're reaching out to other centers and sharing what we're developing and getting their input in that development.
Let's go to a caller. Joe in Rahway, New Jersey is, I believe, a patient calling in who uses an AI app. Joe, you're on WNYC.
Hi, Amina. Thank you. Yes, I am a patient, actually. More than a year ago, I think, my primary care doctor started using this app called Medical Brain, which I guess is an AI interaction app for patients, and he swears by it. And it keeps in contact with me, sometimes daily, checking on my health, asking me for information. So, like, in the morning, sometimes it'll say, "How are you feeling today?" Any changes in your health? Ask me for blood sugar since I'm a diabetes, and blood pressure since I'm a cardiac patient. And as I said, mentioned to the screener, I guess one interesting thing was after major surgery in which they had discontinued the GLP-1 I was on, it asked me to take my blood sugar, which I wasn't really keeping great track of. And when I took it, it was actually very high. And so it prompted me to talk to my GP and say, my sugar's running high. Should we do anything? So it ended up really resulting in me changing medications because the AI had prompted me to go ahead and do that. But yeah, like I said, it will keep track of my daily health. Most recently, since I am a cardiac patient, I have a Bluetooth connected blood pressure cuff, and it feeds the numbers to the AI app. And again, it tells me if I'm running high or running low. It reported, I think yesterday, my averages over time. So when I went to my cardiologist yesterday, I actually could show him that information. So it's really neat. And like I said, my primary care doctor was a real proponent of it at the beginning, and he's part of a major health conglomerate. And I've talked to my other doctors, my cardiologist being one, if they were aware of it, and they weren't. So I don't know if it's throughout their system or he just picked up on it and decided to use it.
And Joe, it's called Medical Brain?
Medical Brain, yes.
All right. Thank you so much for your call, Joe. Dr. Miner, are you familiar with that app?
I'm not familiar with that specific app, but Joe, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think what you've described to us is a great example of the power of the deployment of digital technologies in improving healthcare. And, every time we get on an airplane, the jet engines of that plane are being monitored hundreds, thousands of times a minute. They're relaying information back down to ground on how the engines are doing when service is needed. So there's constant monitoring of the performance of those engines. We're not that far away from having similar opportunities for the performance of our bodies through wearables, and like you were saying, Joe, where your blood sugar, it prompts you to check your blood sugar. It then tells you what that blood sugar level is, and then you also can interact with healthcare professionals. It's just assisting in making sure that the things that need to be monitored are monitored, and when they are elevated or not high enough, that you get a warning, and that also the opportunity to discuss it with your primary care doctor. So it makes the process of care much more effective and efficient, and that's a really good thing.
Here's maybe the flip side to that really good experience. A listener writes, "We used to Google our symptoms. Now we're using AI to diagnose them. How does that change your work when a patient walks in convinced that a chatbot has already found the answer?"
It's a great question, and I'm an otolaryngologist, that word that none of us can pronounce, including those of us in the field. But so I'm an ENT doctor by training, and I focus on inner ear balance disorders. And I described an inner ear disorder earlier in my career. This was in the late 1990s, and for years afterwards, the major source of referrals with this syndrome came from patients who had simply entered their symptoms into a search and been prompted to a website, ours or someone else, describing this syndrome. And then they said, "I think I have this." And then they went to their doctor and they got referred to us or some other place. So we've had these assistance mechanisms for diagnoses for a long time. I think AI will take it to a whole new level. There were people appropriately concerned about, quote, Dr. Google, but I think overall, the more information that patients can have about their health, the better it is. But always keeping in mind that AI is still evolving, there's still hallucinations, and you should always consult a medical professional based upon what you learn from the AI and share what you learn from the AI with them so that they can interpret it and also work with you to make sure that what you're learning from the AI is actually correct.
Listener Ethan in Los Angeles texts, what potential is there for AI to reduce overall healthcare costs, or will this simply expand the scope of services and expenses? I work in tech and have been very excited about LLM and AI. LLM stands for large language model, most especially in its medical applications, where the amount of studies and information is too vast for human ingestion. And I'm excited to hear what your guest is talking about today. Dr. Miner, do you have a take on using AI to reduce overall healthcare costs?
Well, first, Ethan, thank you for your observations and for your question. I believe that in the intermediate and certainly in the long run, that AI is going to dramatically improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of care and therefore reduce cost. Now, how quickly we get to that remains to be determined. I think we're already seeing examples of efficiencies that are reducing cost. Roughly 20% of the cost of healthcare in the United States is spent on administering the system. That 20% has nothing to do with actually the delivery of care. It's the administrative aspects of our care delivery system. So we mentioned before prior authorization. So requesting approval for an insurance company to have a procedure or to have a particular lab test. That now is much more automated than it was before. There still are components of it that require human interactions, but that's an efficiency. We talked before with Joe about care coordination. If we do a better job of coordinating care, particularly for people with chronic medical conditions, that will keep them healthier. That's a good thing, and reduce the need for extensive medical services. Both are good things, keeping people healthy and reducing the need for services because they are healthy. Now, it takes a while to roll this out and get it to the level to which we think it will actually improve both quality of care and lower cost. Mm-hmm. But I'm optimistic that it will. And I think already, Ethan mentioned large language models, already for me as a physician, as an academic leader, the use of curated large language models, that is, large language models trained with the medical literature, has really changed the way we get information on a daily basis. And yes, we still have to be skeptical about what we're seeing, but in curated large language models where we can actually click and go to the primary reference and see the source that was used by the large language model in order to give us that information, that makes validation and verification much more accessible for those of us who are users of large language models.
Here's another text. I'd like to know what this technology is trained on. Given how healthcare is already generally biased against women's and particular Black women's pain, for instance, combined with tech's notoriously biased toward white men because that's who's generally creating it, it's hard not to be concerned that AI in healthcare may have a lot of built-in biases. Dr. Miner, do you address that in your recent article?
It's a really important point. And yes, we know, for example, that clinical trials have not always been representative of the population of patients who may receive a particular therapy. I think AI actually is helping us address those biases because it's pointing, when it's properly trained and when people are using it appropriately, the AI actually points out deficiencies in the sources of information that are leading to a conclusion, and also can help us design studies in order to get to the correct conclusions. For example, we have physicians, faculty members in our emergency department precisely on the topic of pain and chest pain, looking at how different demographic groups, how that pain reported by people in different demographic groups may be associated with different underlying pathologies, so that rather than just a pain score for everybody, we can adjust the pain score based upon what we know from the data. That would have been more difficult to do before we had the data science and analytic methods that we have today. But I do believe that properly deployed, large language models and generative AI will help us to address some of the underlying biases that have come about, because the way we've derived our information, as the listener correctly pointed out, has not always been reflective of broad demographic groups.
Let's go to another call. Here's Catherine in Manhattan with a question. Hi, Catherine. You're on WNYC.
My call. I'm really interested in the high amount of data that AI is able to capture in discovering cancers and other sicknesses. And I wonder if this same AI data has been used by lawmakers and healthcare advocates, things like the EPA, in trying to identify the sources of some of these cancerous pollutants and identify and create regulations and maybe even lawsuits against the polluters. Thank you for considering this question.
Thank you so much for your call, Catherine. And Dr. Miner, I don't know how much you look into, what federal agencies are necessarily doing, but maybe you want to talk about even just the pathology, AI, and how it's used to study some of the causes and mechanisms of diseases?
Yes, I think it's a great question. And we have a Center for Human and Planetary Health here at Stanford that's a collaborative endeavor between the medical school, Stanford Medical School, and our Stanford Dorr School of Sustainability. And one of the things that scientists involved in that center are doing is to analyze data related to air quality and looking at a very detailed level at incidences of cancer in particular areas based upon what we know air quality is, in order to be able to derive relationships that may provide us with insights into the cause of spikes in cancer in particular areas. So that's certainly going on. And Amina, to your question about how AI is being used in pathology, that's one of the areas I'm most excited about, because we've already seen great advances in radiology, for example, from AI. And that's been enabled because we haven't actually used printouts of radiographs now for almost a decade. When you have a chest X-ray or a CT scan, MRI, those images are digital from the time they're taken. So it's been easier to get the data in and train the large language models. Pathology slides are still slides, but now we can digitize those slides, and from that develop methods of analyzing over large data sets, much larger than any human can possibly see in one lifetime, and help pathologists to make the most accurate diagnosis. And we're already seeing improvements in diagnostic accuracy from those technologies.
When you have these powerful diagnostic tools, what is the main concern? Can you talk about maybe cognitive de-skilling and what that means for doctors and their patients?
Yes, it's a great question. And we've already seen some evidence of that. There have been studies published, for example, in colonoscopy, where a gastroenterologist is looking on the video during an endoscopy procedure and determining, is this a polyp? Is this an early stage cancer? Now, those images are also being analyzed by AI. And what we've seen some early evidence is that maybe specialists that rely solely on the AI aren't quite as accurate as they were before they had the benefit of AI. I don't think that means we should stop using AI. I think it means that we have to be very careful in the way we use it and to make sure that we're keeping our skills up as practitioners. But de-skilling we've seen it in other aspects, other medical professions, for example, that used to rely much more on physical diagnosis, listening to heart sounds, for example, or a really, really detailed neurological exam. Now that we have imaging studies, in the case of the heart, we have echocardiography, other imaging for neurology, we have MRI scans. we're able to more accurately diagnose pathologies and plan treatments from the results of an imaging study than from a physical exam alone. So the way we train our students is being adjusted somewhat given that reality. We have to make sure that we don't lose those essential physical diagnosis, those human cognitive skills that have gotten us to where we are today in the process of adopting what are undoubtedly helpful technological advances.
Let's go to another call. James in Wayne, New Jersey. You're on WNYC.
Hello, thanks for the call, and I'm very happy to hear about some of the advances that medicine is being able to utilize AI for. I was a little concerned when you talked about the navigation capacity for AI. I had a patient, for example, gunshot wound, both hands, and he needed to go to rehab, needed Medicaid. But Medicaid doesn't send you directly to rehab unless you cannot walk. So this gentleman had to go out of the hospital, miss out on timely rehab while we danced around a system that wouldn't accommodate that. And I'm afraid that algorithm-based responses are going to be built into the AI systems that are just as complicated, where a patient will be sitting, select 1, select 2, select 3, and will not get the nuanced care or nuanced attention that a human might provide.
And James, you're a practicing medical professional?
I'm an emergency physician.
Emergency physician. Thank you so much for your call, Doctor. Dr. Miner, I mean, this was also, I would love for you to respond directly to James' comment, but this was also a big concern just about this time last year about physicians were raising flags about AI and how it was increasing prior authorization denial. So how do you want to come into that comment?
Well, James, thank you for bringing this to everyone's attention. And yes, I think, and we've seen it before in deployments of new technologies. And it gets back to the important point that we always have to put the patient first and the interests of the patient first. And technology should not get in the way of making the right decision for the patient at the right time. But I certainly am aware that we have seen changes in the way prior authorizations are reviewed, changes in the way they're prepared, and changes in the way approvals, as you noted for this patient, are granted. I think we have to be sure that we point out those deficiencies when they occur, and then we have to be vigilant at making sure that we as a healthcare system within our society are really focused on the well-being of our patients, and that technology is helping us do that and not preventing us from doing that.
And you described an, quote, AI arms race between insurance companies and doctors. Insurers using AI to deny coverage, as we talked about, and doctors fighting back. So what does that look like in practical terms? I mean, have you encountered that?
I think we've encountered some of it. I actually think it's gotten better as both the insurers and doctors and health systems are using AI. I think that now we, if you will, in the arms race, we reached an equal plateau level, so that I think we're seeing fewer and fewer denials that we would consider to be, as James pointed out, arbitrary or capricious. But, it's something that we absolutely have to continue to be vigilant about.
So as we started this segment, Stanford decided to make AI training mandatory. What would AI training, what does it actually look like? What are the students learning to do with these tools?
It's a series of modules that we have for our students, as well as interactions with faculty. I think the big use of AI training for our students and for all of us as practitioners is how do we plan the prompts that we're using with the large language model so that we get the most we can out of that large language model. It's different. It's different than doing a simple search with Google or another search engine. You can get a lot better, more focused information if you plan your prompts. And I should also mention that all of this is available to the public. It's not behind a firewall. If you just go to Stanford Medicine or Stanford School of Medicine, AI and medical education, with any search, you'll come to our website, and all the modules are available for the public to see and use.
That's where we leave it for today. My guest was Dr. Lloyd Minor, Dean of Stanford University School of Medicine and VP of Medical Affairs at Stanford University. Dr. Minor, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. I'm Bridget Bergen, senior reporter in the WNYC and Gothamist newsroom, sitting in for Brian today. Did you hear about the national general strike taking place today? Hundreds of organizations across the country have pledged that their members will skip work, school, and keep their wallets shut today in response to ICE's takeover of Minnesota and other American cities and states, as well as the shootings of American citizens, most prominently Alex Preddy and Renee Good. This comes after Minnesotans held their own general strike last week, in which over 700 businesses closed and an estimated 50 to 100,000 people marched in the streets despite freezing temps. But even if you're hearing the cars honking and your local coffee shop is opening, what's happening today likely won't look like previous general strikes that have shut down cities in the past. So what is happening? Why does it fall short? And could actions like this one build towards something bigger in the near future? With me now to give us a General Strike 101 is Eric Blanc, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at Rutgers University, author of several books, including We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big, and writer of the Substack newsletter, Labor Politics. Hey, Eric, welcome back to WNYC.
Thanks so much for having me on.
And organizers have said that this is under the umbrella national shutdown. They've called for a general strike today. What is a general strike? What are they trying to accomplish today?
A general strike is basically when a majority of workers in a given geographic area, so a city or a state or a country, go out on strike. So the intuition behind it is that this whole system, politically, economically, depends on workers going to work. And when workers withdraw their labor, the system can't function. So you can press demands very powerfully through a general strike. And I think that's why there's been so many calls for general strikes recently, because people are trying to figure out, actually, how do we stop Trump? How do we stop ICE?
So what about the strike that took place last Friday in Minnesota? Do we know anything about the impact it had?
Yeah, I think that it was extremely important of an action, and I would say that same about today. It didn't constitute, I would think, a general strike in the sense that a majority of workers in Minneapolis didn't strike, but there were significant numbers of workers that did strike. We saw a lot of small businesses shut down. Certainly, the school system struck, and the school system was shut down. And then there were walkouts in certain other retail agencies. So it was not a general strike in that sense, but I think it aspired in that direction, and it helped to get the idea out about a general strike. And it really helped to pinpoint the idea that we do have agency. There's things that we can do to push back against what's going on.
We have seen a lot of mass mobilizations over the last 10 years that Trump has been in and out of power. What makes a general strike different from just a protest?
Well, the basic difference is that when you are on strike, the institutions that depend on your labor don't function. So that's different. If you go to a protest, at a rally, no institution per se is disrupted. But if you are, let's say, a Hilton worker, so Hilton is one of the companies that is playing a really central role on a national level at housing ICE agents. If Hilton hotel workers don't go into work, then it makes it very difficult for ICE to use hotels or to rent cars or whatever the different, whatever the different company might be. When you are on strike, you're preventing that company or a public institution from functioning. That's the major difference.
So then, Eric, what value do you see in something like the No Kings protests that we've seen a lot of, in in recent years, there's another that's expected to come up later this year. Is this a situation where it's these differing tactics can both have a certain effect, kind of a yes and situation, or is one approach really better than the other?
I think that you definitely need a variety of tactics to win. And you can't just call a general strike just like that. And so I think that part of the importance of the No Kings protests is that particularly early on, when there was this idea that Trump was claiming a mandate for all of his policies, the No Kings protests really put a lie to that by showing that there was millions and millions of people across the country who were not only opposed but were willing to take to the streets. And so protests, I think, are and remain a really crucial way for ordinary people to take a first step towards action. It's unlikely they're going to take more risky steps right at first. So you need to have easy entry points for people. And I think that is really the role of these protests. But the question then becomes, especially after you've gone to a few of these rallies, well, what next? What do we do to scale up? And what do we do to escalate? Because the protests on their own are not enough.
Listeners, are you participating in today's general strike? Are you not showing up to work or school, or maybe closing your business for the day? Maybe you're opening your business for organizers and members of the community to congregate. Tell us if and how you're joining in and what effect you hope today's actions will have on the country. We can also take your questions for my guest, Eric Blanc, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at Rutgers University and writer of the Substack Labor Politics. The number is 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can call or text. And already we have a caller, Julia in Brooklyn. Julia, you're on WNYC.
Hi, thanks for taking me. Eric, I'm in the middle of reading your book right now, and I read it while I'm at work on my union job. I'm getting ready for work right now. Unfortunately, I can't participate in the strike in that way, but I canceled my Prime subscription again, which I have to renew sometimes for work. I've been affected by strikes for 6 months. I probably have double in my bank account right now if it wasn't for the writers and actors strike. And I think a general strike, a one-day general strike in response to the killings in Minneapolis is nice, but it's not enough. We need organized demands. We need an organized strike. The UAW has been talking about doing this on May Day in 2028, I believe, and I think that's what's really going to be effective. I'm wondering what you think about that. Thank you.
Julia, thanks for that call. Any reaction to that? I mean, May Day 2028 feels like a long time from now.
Yeah, I think that one of the lessons from U.S. labor history and world labor history is that general strikes tend to come in sort of an explosive way. It's not normally the case that you just sort of set a date for a general strike and then it happens. It tends to be at moments of very high momentum, high attention, sort of high levels of struggle, something similar to the feeling that we had and that we still have right after Renee Good was murdered and Alex Preddy was murdered. So when all of the eyes are watching and when there's a mass outrage at what either the employers or the state are doing, it tends to be in those moments where general strikes become possible. So I don't actually think it's so useful to sort of assume that we can orient towards 2028 as the general strike. I think it's more important to do everything possible at this moment to start getting as many working people into motion, because that's going to be the basis through which you could have a general strike whenever it might be. So it's not just that it's too long down the road, but we need far more working people involved in the fight against ICE for something like a general strike to succeed. Because even in Minnesota, it didn't go as far as it needed to, and that's in a place where they have a huge amount of organization, where they're just heroic action. So I think that should be sobering. We have a lot of work to do, particularly in the private sector, where these companies are so ruthless against their employees, to get those workers to walk out at the Targets, at the McDonald's, at the tech companies, which can put a real hurt on the bottom line of corporate America. That's going to take a lot of organizing. And I think it's not going to look like agitating for a strike immediately. It's going to look more like fighting around things that the company could do in the short term, demanding the companies break from ICE. Those types of more intermediary battles, I think, are probably the important stepping stone towards building towards a general strike.
Eric, I want to get a little bit into the history of general strikes here in the United States and elsewhere, but we asked for some calls and texts from listeners, and I think to your point about the challenge of organizing something like a general strike, a listener texted a serious question. There's a general strike today? I'm signed up for various organizations pertaining to protests and have seen or heard nothing at all about a general strike today. What do you make of that when you talk about this is something that needs to build on momentum? People are on all different social media platforms. Our media landscape is incredibly fractured. This is a real organizing challenge, right?
I think part of what happened today is that there's so many people looking for things to do that a call for a general strike that really was not put forward, as far as I know, by sort of major unions or even huge organizations nationally. I think it caught the imagination, particularly because there was, and it's a good thing, there was a lot of celebrities and influencers talking about it, so it's caught on. But it's not, I don't think, a real general strike. And I think the positive of talking, everybody who's taking action today, thank you for doing that. Every single thing you can do to show support for Minneapolis and to stop ICE, I think, is important. On the other hand, it's also important to not lose sight of the fact that we have ways to go towards building a real general strike. And there's a potential downside of the boy who cried wolf, whereas if we always say this is a general strike, then the actual necessity for a real general strike where we actually shutter the economy and shutter cities from functioning until we get our demands, that's going to be harder, I think, to articulate to people if they think we've already done it. And then they'll say, well, if we had a general strike, why didn't we stop ICE? And I think we have to, really explain, well, no, when you shut down a city, when you shut down the country, everybody knows there's no sort of gray area about it. And if we're going to talk about ending ICE, and if we're going to talk about saving democracy against Trump's very likely attempts to steal it, then I think we need to have a vision of what a full general strike looks like.
Well, let's talk about what a general strike has looked like in the past in the United States that was successful. What did it look like on the ground, and what did they achieve?
Yeah, the United States has a very rich tradition of general strikes. And so it's certainly part of our political legacy and the labor movement's legacy. Two, examples I could think of. Oh, I'll give you one. 1934, San Francisco. So this is a very famous general strike. Started with longshore workers, the dock workers were on strike for a union, and the police killed 2 workers on Bloody Thursday. And in response to that killing, which I think you can see some parallels to today in Minneapolis,
Absolutely.
The outrage was so high that workers across the city ended up striking for up to a week. And it was out of that struggle that the Longshore Union was born, and they won their union. And it was really out of that struggle that the New Deal and mass unionization became the norm, and struggles like that across the country. So yeah, there's a really, really rich tradition. But when you do it, they shut down all of San Francisco. Workers didn't go to work, and it was not just the longshore. What makes it a general strike is when other workers who maybe weren't first involved also join in. It's across industries.
Sure.
And I would just point out that one of the crucial lessons from that is it often takes a spark. The question I have today is, who are those first workers who are going to walk out? It's not necessarily going to be everyone decides we're going to have a general strike at first, but we need some workers to take the initiative. And to me, that's really the question, because most general strikes have come out of snowball effects from specific groups of workers fighting, and then that going on and kind of avalanching to the rest of the working class.
Eric, in that example that you just described, the demands of the workers, or the result of that general strike, was something that was fairly distinct. The formation of the Longshore Union, the Longshore Workers Union. Are there other examples of general strikes in history that are more about political power and that were able to push for policy changes, which seems a little bit more aligned with what we are seeing in this current environment?
Yeah, you don't have to look very far back or very far away. Just look at Puerto Rico in 2019. So in the summer of 2019, there was a huge scandal because the governor, which is the head of Puerto Rico, Rosselló, was leaked a very extremely offensive chat he was part of, leaked a telegram chat, and it got leaked to the public, in which he both was homophobic and racist and said horrible things about various people, but particularly against the Puerto Rican people who had suffered so much under Hurricane Maria. And the outrage was so much, and this was in the context not just of this particular scandal, but in decades of neoliberalism and economic inequality and government corruption and sort of inability and unwillingness to meet people's needs after the hurricanes. So there was so much anger erupted in response to these leaked chats that workers called general strike, and there was mass protests. And over the span of 2 to 3 weeks, these mass protests combined with workers' strikes eventually forced the governor to resign. That was the demand: is renuncia, resign now. And they won. And so I do think that that's a really important example close to home that we can look to, because it might take something like that to keep our democracy and to stop ICE.
If you're just joining us, listeners, this is the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Bridget Bergen, filling in for Brian today, and I'm speaking with Eric Blanc, Assistant Professor of Labor Studies at Rutgers University and author of several books, including We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big, and the writer of the Substack newsletter Labor Politics. We're talking about today's general strike. And I want to go to our first caller, Daniel in San Francisco. Our second caller. Daniel, thanks for calling WNYC.
Good morning. Just calling, Professor, I appreciate everything you're saying and labor perspective on this. I'm hoping, too, that you could talk about our power as consumers on a day like today and moving forward with collective action to try to bring about the change that we're looking for. Labor is absolutely an essential element, but I think, too, if we withhold our buying power, that we have a lot of power there in sending a message. I myself am a small business owner. I have literally no employees, and people are asking me if I'm closing today. I would love to, but that's just not the reality of the margins of my business. But I think that focusing our economic power on small businesses, such as mine, this is a little self-serving, and taking it away from the entrenched economic powers, we can get a lot done that way. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that.
Thanks for your call, Daniel.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that consumer boycotts can be extremely powerful. I mean, just look at how Disney was forced to rehire Jimmy Kimmel. Just look at how Elon Musk was forced out of the White House with the Tesla takedown protests. So we've seen that consumer boycotts can be extremely effective. I think the question is, how do you make those boycotts real? Because so much of the discourse online is just stop shopping at Amazon, just stop shopping this, that, and the other place. And it's very hard to measure, and it's very hard for it to really catch on because no one's sure if other people are doing it. And frankly, for most working people, it's not so easy just to stop shopping at the most convenient or cheapest place. So the secret, I think, to an effective boycott is having very targeted demands and really specific time amount that you're asking people to boycott. Not an indefinite stop shopping at Amazon, but maybe one day. So like today, but imagine if so many more organizations, the unions, plus Indivisible, plus political figures like Bernie Sanders or Zoran or Elizabeth Warren were calling for a boycott, so that it really had that millions of people involved and not just thousands. When you get to that scale, that's really how you get that impact. And so the question is, again, how do you get to the scale necessary in which the bottom line is really starts to feel hurt?
A listener texted this question: what about a mass boycott of social media platforms, Apple, Google, and streaming services like Paramount? I'm curious what you think of that, Eric, in part because it seems that, in our current communication ecosystem, those tools are often organizing tools for something like this.
I think that it is urgently necessary for us to move in the direction of a boycott of all of the companies that are collaborating with ICE. And so that includes many of the big platforms. So, Microsoft and Facebook, and particularly Amazon, have deep, connections to ICE. And I think that, yeah, that's one crucial thing. But it's not just the platforms, it's not just the subscriptions, as important that is. There's companies, as I mentioned, Hilton, that are deeply embedded, and there's so many companies that have contracts with ICE, even though it's not even central to their business model, and that we could be fighting to end their contracts. So things like UPS, FedEx, why are they contracting with ICE? And so if we have a boycott, not just of the platforms, but of these companies on a specific day that we can measure and say, we are taking a stand, we are not going to allow business as usual, then I think it's that broader fight that's going to be really impactful.
I want to go to James on the Upper West Side. James, you're on WNYC.
Yeah, hi. I'm horrified by the Trump administration, and I think by what's going on in Minneapolis. I want to question, though, in New York City a couple nights ago, the Hilton that was renting rooms to ICE agents, although it seemed like the protesters weren't even exactly sure they were there. They not only protested out in front, but they went into the lobby, 60, 70 people. NYPD had to come and remove them. Who knows how much police overtime was needed for that. The idea that the Hilton should not even be renting room size. Let's imagine that Planned Parenthood was having a big conference in Manhattan next week, and the so-called right to life people. I mean, I'm totally pro-choice, but they decided, you know what, this is outrageous that Hilton is renting rooms to Planned Parenthood. We're going to go into the lobby of Hilton. I just think some tactics are, frankly, and you mentioned UPS and FedEx. I mean, protesting ICE is one thing, but expecting all these companies to have these litmus tests that they're not even going to do business with ICE, I guess I sort of question that at some point.
James, thanks for your call. Any response to that, Eric?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the extent to which you and we feel that what ICE is doing is just beyond the pale. I don't think that people are calling for boycotts willy-nilly, or I certainly don't think that that's the case. I think that when you have a paramilitary force with masked up, with no accountability, murdering people in the streets, that is, I think, something worth disrupting over. People in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, they protested to end Jim Crow, and there was a lot of disruption. And at the time, a lot of what they did was seen as very sort of extreme. Why are you sitting in at these segregated, restaurants? Why can't you just work through the process? And what they said was, we need to force the system to stop treating us like we're not human, and we are going to take the actions necessary to make that happen. And so, yeah, I actually think it's absolutely urgent for people to continue organizing at Hilton's and beyond to put pressure on these companies to break. And I think that any company that says it upholds American values while profiting off of the terrorization of our communities is a company that we should be disrupting as much as possible, non-violently, of course. Any property destruction or violence just plays into the hands of ICE. But yeah, now's the moment. I don't think that we can afford just to continue with business as usual or just protest on weekends.
Eric, I want to bring you back to a text from a listener. This listener writes, the common theme I'm hearing in this discussion is the opposition movement needs more leadership, more guidance, and more organization. Which kind of brings me to the question, why aren't unions joining in today's protest? Our first caller said she was getting ready for work. She was in a union. But this seems like a moment where, unions would potentially want to stand up. Why aren't we seeing more of those organizations kind of seizing the day?
The first thing I would say is that unions did play a crucial role in the mass strike last Friday in Minneapolis, that the call came from unions like the local SEIU and Unite Here, as well as community groups. So in Minneapolis, the unions have played a central, or not all of the unions, but at least some of the more progressive unions have played a central role in the fight back. But the question is well taken. The norm is that most unions are at best continuing with business as usual. And at worst, frankly, some of them are even cozying up to the administration. And so the reality is that I think most union leaders understand what ICE is doing is horrifying and they want to fight back. But the level of conservatism, not in the political sense, but in the sort of risk aversion sense, is extremely high. These are organizations that were built out of struggle a century ago, but in which most of the current leaders are not people with a lot of deep experience in how to fight authoritarianism or to take disruptive action. And frankly, they haven't been up to the challenge. The reality is that the moment of crisis we're in, an authoritarian takeover, has mostly been met with, sleepwalking. And that's not, I don't think, true so much in New York City. I think we can be really happy that the hands-off New York City coalition has a lot of union support, the Central Labor Council. I think New York is one of the places that we can show the rest of the country what a labor movement that fights back looks like. But it's going to require taking more risks, and it's going to require more than just saying we're going to do, another protest after another. I think that it doesn't require immediately calling for a general strike. I don't think we're at that moment in New York, but I would like to see unions really take a step up towards the type of nonviolent disruption that we've seen at the Hiltons. And if unions are putting their support towards, breaking these companies from ICE, there's a huge amount of leverage there. And I'm encouraged that a lot of unions, I think, are going to start moving in that direction. And it's better now than never.
We have a whole bunch of callers, and I want to sneak in as many as we can before we let you go, Eric. We've got Susan in Manhattan with a question for you. Go ahead, Susan.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I'm wondering about the potential for retaliation, and perhaps there's a difference between union and non-union members depending on their contracts. But I'm thinking there may be many employees in many companies, and I'm thinking particularly of the lower wage ones who would want to participate but are worried about either losing pay or perhaps even being suspended or having some mark on their performance review. What difference might there be there with the union and non-union, if you can also speak to the non-union? I'm wondering how many people are hesitant but would really like to participate but are worried about their jobs.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think precisely for that reason, it's why it's not likely that we'll see a general strike just by somebody calling for it, because workers need to go through a process of feeling more empowered and feeling like they're not going to be left alone. So the way you overcome fear is by taking sort of baby steps that help people understand that I am not alone, that if I'm taking an action, there's going to be thousands, millions of people doing it with me. So for instance, to concretize it, instead of calling for a strike right now in the tech companies, what tech workers are doing is that they've organized an open letter, which folks can check out by going to iceout.tech. And so they've had over 1,000 tech workers and even some sort of intermediary, like middle-level manager types, have signed a letter calling on their companies, Google, Meta, NVIDIA, OpenAI, to break from ICE. And that's a risk because we all know what the Trump administration and many of these companies who have allied with them are willing to do, but it's a lower level risk. Just saying, I'm against this is not the type of thing that at least should result in you getting fired. And so I think we're going to need a lot of those types of actions, workers speaking out first. And then when you see, actually, we have a critical mass, well, then that raises the question, what are we going to do with all these people? What are we going to do if the companies aren't listening to us? And I think that that's true for anybody out there, whether you're in a union or not. You don't need to be in a union to take action at work or even to strike. The right to strike is actually not contingent on being in a union. And I would say for anybody out there who works for a company that is collaborating with ICE, and you can look it up, a lot of companies you might not expect are collaborating with ICE. They have contracts. Folks can check out some of the writings I've done on my Substack, Labor Politics, of listing out these companies. But what I would encourage above all is, if you think that you want to fight against ICE, you have the opportunity of doing that at work and as consumers, and people can reach out to the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee which is a organization that supports any worker in any industry, whether you're a union or not, start fighting back, including against ICE right now. Why not do petitions like the tech workers are doing? If you're working anywhere, if you're working at Target, if you're working at McDonald's, some of these other companies that are collaborating with ICE, and you can go to EWOC to get support. That's organizeworkers.org. That's how you get support anywhere you're at.
Let's get in one more caller who I think has something that is happening today for people who are interested. Let's go to Jeff in Inwood. You're on WNYC.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for taking my call, and thank you for having this conversation. It's an important one. Yes, there's a vigil this afternoon at 4 o'clock in Foley Square in support of the folks that are out in the cold in Minneapolis. I also want to make a comment that there's a number of organizations that are organizing right now for a future general strike way before 2028. Rise and Resist, Sunrise Movement, Indivisible, DSA, all these organizations are all working together to plan future events. So I encourage folks to check those organizations out and they could potentially get involved. There was a big national call that Sunrise Movement had the other night where there was thousands of people on the call talking about different planning events that Sunrise Movement is having. So I encourage folks to check out these different organizations. Thank you.
Jeff, thanks for that. Eric, just as we wrap up here, I think we've established the difference between some of these smaller scale strikes and something that would be defined as a general strike. But what is the best thing that you think can come out of the efforts and sacrifices people are making across the country today?
I think what it shows is that many people are willing to take an extra step to stop the horrors that we're seeing. And so the fact that people are taking the risk of not going into work today or taking the sacrifice of not shopping, I think that shows that people understand the gravity of what's going on, and that what we need now is for that inspiration to spread. And that's going to take a lot of organizing. It's going to take a lot of agitation. But I think that we're in a moment in which what Trump's administration and ICE are doing is so unpopular that things that we thought were unimaginable, impossible, even a few months ago, are now on the agenda because the level of anger of what's going on is so high. So I think that today keeps the momentum up, and we need to seize that momentum to have more walkouts, maybe starting with student walkouts, move towards these big campaigns against the companies. And it's through that mass activity where we have millions of people involved that things like general strikes will become real.
Eric Blanc is assistant professor of labor studies at Rutgers University, author of several books, including We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big, and writer of the Substack newsletter, Labor Politics. Eric, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Brian Lehrer Weekend. We're back on the radio Monday morning at 10 a.m. In the meantime, follow us on Blue Sky at The Brian Lehrer Show, where there's always a conversation 24/7.